What drives ordinary people to abandon everything they know and follow charismatic leaders into darkness? If you're fascinated by the psychology behind history's most notorious cults and want to understand how manipulation, control, and tragedy unfold in real time, you've found the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now because we're about to dive deep into stories that will challenge everything you think you know about human nature, religious freedom, and the dangerous power of blind faith. I'm Boring Nightmares, and this is where we explore the twisted minds and devastating consequences of the world's deadliest cults. When most people hear the word cult, they think of wild-eyed fanatics in remote compounds, chanting in robes and surrendering their life savings to charismatic leaders. But the most dangerous cults are the ones that don't look like cults at all. They operate in plain sight, wearing the masks of legitimate organizations, spiritual movements, and even health programs. These groups perfect the art of psychological manipulation, slowly drawing in intelligent, successful people who never thought they could fall victim to such control. Today, we're exposing 3 of the most insidious cults that have operated in modern America. These aren't fringe groups hiding in the wilderness. These are sophisticated organizations that have destroyed thousands of lives while maintaining facades of respectability. The Fellowship of Friends convinced brilliant minds to surrender their fortunes for promises of higher consciousness. The Narconon program lured desperate families seeking addiction treatment into Scientology's web of control, and the Remnant Fellowship used twisted religious teachings to justify horrific abuse, culminating in tragedy that shocked the world. What makes these cults particularly terrifying is how they've adapted to our modern world. They use legitimate-sounding names, professional websites, and carefully crafted marketing to attract victims. They prey on our deepest vulnerabilities, our desire for meaning, our need for healing, our search for spiritual truth. By the time victims realize what's happening, they're already trapped in systems designed to break down their independence and critical thinking. The Fellowship of Friends presents itself as a school for higher consciousness, but behind its intellectual facade lies a web of financial exploitation and sexual abuse that has persisted for over 5 decades. Founded in 1970 by Robert Earl Burton in California's Sierra Nevada foothills, this group has perfected the art of attracting educated, affluent individuals seeking spiritual enlightenment. Burton claimed to be a conscious being who had achieved a level of awareness beyond ordinary humans. He taught that most people live in a state of sleep, and that only through his guidance could students achieve true consciousness. This teaching formed the foundation for absolute control over members' lives. Burton positioned himself as the sole conduit to higher spiritual realms, making questioning his authority equivalent to rejecting enlightenment itself. The recruitment process was sophisticated and targeted. The fellowship actively sought professionals, artists, and intellectuals, particularly those going through life transitions or spiritual searching. They held introductory meetings in major cities, presenting Burton's teachings as a rare opportunity to study with a truly enlightened master. New members were gradually introduced to increasingly demanding requirements, each presented as necessary steps toward higher consciousness. Financial exploitation was central to the fellowship's operation. Members were required to pay substantial monthly fees, often hundreds or thousands of dollars, regardless of their financial situation. But this was just the beginning. Burton convinced followers that material wealth was an obstacle to spiritual development, leading many to donate their entire life savings, homes, and inheritances to the organization. Some members worked in fellowship businesses for minimal wages, while their earnings flowed to Burton's lavish lifestyle. The group's headquarters, a sprawling compound called Apollo in Oregon House, California, became a self-contained world where normal social rules didn't apply. Burton lived in opulent luxury, surrounded by expensive art, fine wines, and antiques purchased with members' donations. He claimed these material possessions were necessary for his spiritual work, teaching about higher refinement while living like a king. Sexual abuse was systematic and protected by the organization's structure. Burton, despite claiming celibacy was necessary for spiritual development, engaged in sexual relationships with male members, particularly younger men. He convinced victims that sexual contact with him was a spiritual privilege that would accelerate their consciousness development. The organization's hierarchy actively covered up these abuses, silencing victims through shame, spiritual manipulation, and threats of expulsion. Former members describe a culture of fear and control that pervaded every aspect of life. Members were encouraged to move to the compound, where they lived in communal housing under constant surveillance. Daily life was micromanaged through endless rules about everything from diet to sleep schedules. Burton claimed to receive messages from deceased historical figures, including Jesus and Leonardo da Vinci, who supposedly guided the organization's decisions through him. The psychological manipulation was particularly sophisticated. Burton taught that negative emotions were signs of spiritual weakness, effectively preventing members from processing their doubts or trauma. He reframed criticism as spiritual tests and portrayed outside family and friends as obstacles to enlightenment. Members were taught to view their pre-fellowship lives as meaningless and to see leaving the group as spiritual suicide. The fellowship's international expansion brought their exploitation to a global scale. They established centers in major cities worldwide, recruiting members from diverse cultural backgrounds while maintaining the same controlling structure. Members were often required to travel to California for intensive training periods, during which they were subjected to intense psychological pressure and financial demands. Legal challenges have plagued the fellowship for decades, but Burton's legal team has successfully deflected most serious consequences. Former members have filed numerous lawsuits alleging fraud, sexual abuse, and labor violations, but the organization's wealth and legal resources have protected it from major accountability. The group continues to operate, with Burton, now in his 80s, still maintaining absolute control over hundreds of members worldwide. The lasting damage to former members is profound. Many describe decades of recovery from the psychological trauma of fellowship membership. They struggle with damaged relationships, financial ruin, and the challenge of rebuilding identities that were systematically dismantled. Some never fully recover from the experience of believing they had found ultimate truth, only to discover they had been victims of sophisticated manipulation. The Narconon program represents one of Scientology's most insidious fronts, using the desperation of addiction to recruit new members into L. Ron Hubbard's controversial organization. Marketed as a revolutionary drug rehabilitation program, Narconon has operated for over 50 years, targeting vulnerable individuals and families desperate for effective addiction treatment. Founded in 1966 by Scientologist William Benitez while he was incarcerated in Arizona State Prison, Narconon was originally presented as a secular addiction treatment program. However, the program is entirely based on Scientology principles and serves as a recruitment tool for the Church of Scientology. The program uses Hubbard's technology, including his theories about mental health, drug addiction, and spiritual development, despite Hubbard having no medical or psychological training. The Narconon treatment protocol is both medically dangerous and scientifically unsound. The program's cornerstone is the Purification Rundown, a detoxification process that involves taking massive doses of vitamins, particularly niacin, while spending an hours in extremely hot saunas. Participants are told this process will eliminate drug residues from their bodies, a claim that has no scientific basis and has resulted in numerous medical emergencies and deaths. Medical professionals have consistently condemned Narconon's practices as dangerous pseudoscience. The program's vitamin regimen can cause liver damage, kidney problems, and dangerous electrolyte imbalances. The extended sauna sessions can lead to dehydration, heat stroke, and cardiovascular complications. Despite these risks, Narconon facilities often operate with minimal medical supervision, sometimes lacking qualified medical staff entirely. The program's curriculum is lifted directly from Scientology training materials, with religious terminology replaced by secular language. Students study Hubbard's theories about the mind, ethics, and communication, gradually being indoctrinated into Scientology beliefs without being told they're receiving religious instruction. The program teaches that addiction is caused by reactive mind and past traumatic experiences, concepts central to Scientology doctrine. Recruitment tactics exploit families' desperation and love for addicted relatives. Narconon marketing presents impressive success rates, claiming up to 76% of graduates remain drug-free, a statistic that has never been independently verified and contradicts all credible research on addiction treatment. Families are told their loved ones have failed because other treatment programs don't address the spiritual aspects of addiction that only Narconon understands. The financial exploitation begins immediately. Narconon programs cost tens of thousands of dollars, often requiring families to exhaust their savings, take out loans, or mortgage their homes. Unlike legitimate treatment programs, Narconon rarely accepts insurance, claiming their unique approach isn't covered by traditional medical insurance. When families can't afford the full program, they're encouraged to recruit others or work for Narconon to pay off their debts. Students who complete the program often find themselves deeply indoctrinated into Scientology beliefs and heavily recruited to join the organization. Many are convinced to become Narconon staff members, working for minimal wages while believing they're saving lives. Others are directed to Scientology organizations for further spiritual development, having been thoroughly prepared for recruitment through months of Scientology training disguised as addiction treatment. The program's residential facilities have been sites of numerous tragedies. Deaths have occurred at Narconon centers due to medical neglect, inadequate supervision, and dangerous treatment protocols. Investigations have revealed facilities operating without proper licenses, employing unqualified staff, and failing to provide appropriate medical care for serious addiction-related health issues. Government investigations have repeatedly found Narconon programs in violation of health and safety regulations. Several states have shut down Narconon facilities or revoked their licenses after discovering dangerous practices and fraudulent claims. However, the organization typically relocates and reopens under new names, continuing to exploit vulnerable populations seeking addiction treatment. The psychological manipulation employed by Narconon is particularly cruel because it targets people at their most vulnerable moments. Addicted individuals and their families are told that questioning the program or seeking alternative treatment demonstrates lack of commitment to recovery. Students are isolated from outside support systems and encouraged to view Narconon as their only hope for sobriety. Former participants describe a culture of surveillance and control that mirrors other cult environments. Students are monitored constantly, their communications restricted, and their contacts with outside family and friends limited. Those who express doubts or attempt to leave are subjected to intense pressure, guilt manipulation, and threats that leaving the program will result in relapse and death. The lasting damage extends beyond the immediate victims to their families and communities. Families who entrust their loved ones to Narconon often find themselves financially devastated and emotionally traumatized when they discover the true nature of the organization. Communities suffer when legitimate addiction treatment resources are diverted to programs that not only fail to address addiction, but actively harm those seeking help. The Remnant Fellowship began as what appeared to be a Christian weight loss program, but evolved into one of the most controlling and abusive religious cults in modern American history. Founded by Gwen Shamblin in 1999, this Tennessee-based organization used twisted biblical interpretations to justify extreme control over members' lives, leading to child abuse, broken families, and ultimately tragedy that captured international attention. Gwen Shamblin initially gained fame through her Way Down workshop, a program that combined Christian faith with weight loss by teaching that overeating was a sin and that true Christians should be thin. Her message resonated with millions of Americans struggling with weight issues, particularly Christian women who felt guilty about their relationship with food. Shamblin's charismatic personality and apparent success in maintaining her own dramatic weight loss made her a sought-after speaker and author. The transition from weight loss guru to cult leader was gradual but deliberate. Shamblin began claiming that most churches had corrupted Christianity and that she had received special revelation about God's true will. She established the Remnant Fellowship as a church for those who truly wanted to follow God's commands, positioning herself as the sole interpreter of biblical truth. This exclusive claim to divine knowledge became the foundation for absolute control over members' lives. The group's interpretation of Christianity was extreme and often contradicted mainstream Christian doctrine. Shamblin taught that God demanded complete submission to authority, with her as the ultimate earthly authority. She claimed that questioning her teachings was equivalent to questioning God himself. Members were taught that suffering and sacrifice were proof of faith, setting the stage for accepting increasingly abusive treatment as spiritual discipline. Child discipline within the Remnant Fellowship was particularly horrific. Shamblin taught that children were naturally evil and required harsh physical punishment to break their will and make them submissive to God. Parents were instructed to use implements like plumbing supply line to beat their children, sometimes for hours, until the child showed complete submission. This abuse was presented as biblical child rearing and necessary for the child's spiritual salvation. The organization's control extended to every aspect of members' lives. Shamblin dictated what members could eat, where, and how they should style their hair. She arranged marriages between members and controlled their reproductive decisions. Members were required to live in the Brentwood, Tennessee area to be under direct supervision, often abandoning careers and extended family relationships to comply with this requirement. Financial exploitation was systematic and complete. Members were required to tithe not just 10% of their income, but often much more. Shamblin convinced followers that material wealth was a sign of God's blessing, but that blessing required absolute financial submission to the church. Many members turned over their entire life savings, homes, and inheritances to the organization, leaving them completely dependent on the group for survival. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and all-encompassing. Members were taught that their thoughts and feelings were unreliable and potentially sinful. Shamblin claimed the ability to discern people's spiritual state and would publicly humiliate members who showed signs of doubt or independence. She used shame, fear, and spiritual manipulation to maintain control, convincing members that leaving the group would result in eternal damnation. The group's isolation tactics were particularly effective in maintaining control. Members were discouraged from maintaining relationships with non-members, including family members who wouldn't join the organization. Children were homeschooled using curriculum that reinforced the group's teachings and were forbidden from participating in outside activities that might expose them to different ideas or values. Medical neglect was another form of control employed by the remnant fellowship. Shamblin taught that illness was often caused by sin and that faith healing was superior to medical treatment. Members were discouraged from seeking medical care, sometimes with fatal consequences. The organization's emphasis on thinness led to eating disorders among members, but seeking treatment was viewed as lack of faith. The group's practices came under scrutiny following several high-profile cases of child abuse and neglect. The death of 8-year-old Joseph Smith in 2003, whose parents were Remnant Fellowship members, brought national attention to the organization's child discipline practices. The parents were convicted of murder after evidence showed they had followed the group's teachings about beating children into submission. Legal challenges mounted as former members came forward with allegations of abuse, fraud, and psychological manipulation. However, the organization's status as a religious institution provided some protection from prosecution. Shamblin's legal team successfully argued that many of the group's practices were protected religious expression, making it difficult for authorities to intervene effectively. The dramatic end came in May 2021 when Gwen Shamblin, her husband Joe Lara, and 5 other church leaders died in a plane crash while traveling to a church event. The crash occurred just as the HBO documentary series, The Way Down, was exposing the organization's abusive practices to a global audience. Shamblin's death left the organization in chaos, with her daughter Elizabeth Shamblin Hannah attempting to maintain control of the remaining members. The aftermath of Shamblin's death revealed the extent of the organization's control and the difficulty former members faced in rebuilding their lives. Many had no financial resources, professional skills, or support networks outside the group. Children who had been raised in the organization struggled with basic social skills and had to learn to navigate a world they had been taught was evil and dangerous. The lasting impact of the remnant fellowship extends beyond its immediate victims to the broader understanding of how religious authority can be abused. The organization demonstrated how quickly a seemingly legitimate religious movement can become a destructive cult when followers surrender their critical thinking to charismatic leaders who claim divine authority. These three organizations represent the evolution of cult manipulation in the modern era. They show us that the most dangerous cults are not the obvious ones with compound walls and matching outfits, but the sophisticated ones that adapt to our contemporary world. Now let's examine the Fellowship of Friends more closely, because what Robert Burton created wasn't just a spiritual community. It was a carefully engineered system of control that would make any cult leader envious. The Fellowship operates on what they call the Fourth Way, a teaching supposedly based on the work of George Gurdjieff and Peter Ouspensky. But Burton twisted these philosophical concepts into something far more sinister. At the Fellowship's compound in Oregon House, California, members live in a bizarre alternate reality where Burton's every word is treated as divine revelation. He claims to be in direct communication with what he calls conscious beings, 44 historical figures including Jesus, Buddha, and Shakespeare, who allegedly speak through him. Members are expected to accept these claims without question, creating an environment where critical thinking is not just discouraged, but seen as spiritually dangerous. The financial exploitation is breathtaking in its scope. Members are required to pay monthly fees that can range from hundreds to thousands of dollars, depending on their income level. But that's just the beginning. The Fellowship owns and operates multiple businesses, wineries, restaurants, and cultural centers, all staffed by members who work for minimal wages, while the profits flow directly to Burton's lavish lifestyle. He lives in a mansion filled with expensive art and antiques, travels the world in luxury, and maintains multiple properties, all funded by followers who often struggle financially. The sexual abuse allegations against Burton are extensive and well documented. Former members have reported that he used his position of spiritual authority to coerce young men into sexual relationships. The pattern is always the same. Burton would claim that sexual contact with him was part of their spiritual development, a necessary step in their evolution toward higher consciousness. When victims tried to speak out, they were silenced through a combination of spiritual manipulation and legal threats. What makes the Fellowship particularly insidious is how it isolates members from the outside world. They're encouraged to live in the compound, work for Fellowship businesses, and socialize only with other members. This creates a closed information loop where Burton's version of reality becomes the only reality. Members are taught that any criticism of Burton or the Fellowship comes from lower spiritual forces trying to prevent their development. The psychological control techniques used by the Fellowship are sophisticated and multifaceted. Members are subjected to constant evaluation and criticism from other members, creating an atmosphere of perpetual anxiety and self-doubt. They're taught to view their own thoughts and emotions as obstacles to spiritual growth, effectively severing their connection to their own inner guidance system. This makes them completely dependent on Burton's interpretation of their experiences. The group uses a practice called self-remembering, which sounds innocent enough, but is actually a form of dissociation. Members are taught to constantly observe themselves from outside their own experience, creating a split between the observer and the observed. While this might seem like mindfulness, it's actually designed to prevent members from fully engaging with their emotions and instincts, the very things that might warn them they're being manipulated. Former members describe the fellowship as a golden cage. The community can seem appealing from the outside: beautiful grounds, cultural events, sophisticated discussions about art and philosophy. But beneath this veneer lies a system designed to extract maximum value from members while keeping them psychologically dependent. Those who try to leave often face intense pressure to stay, including threats of spiritual damnation and social ostracism. The fellowship's response to criticism and legal challenges reveals the true nature of the organization. Rather than addressing the allegations honestly, they've consistently attacked the credibility of former members and used legal intimidation to silence critics. They've hired expensive law firms to file lawsuits against journalists and former members who speak out, creating a chilling effect that prevents many victims from coming forward. What's particularly disturbing is how the fellowship has managed to maintain its operations despite decades of allegations and legal challenges. Burton continues to recruit new members, particularly targeting vulnerable individuals going through life transitions. The group has expanded internationally, with centers in multiple countries, spreading their toxic influence across the globe. The psychological damage inflicted by the fellowship extends far beyond the immediate trauma of abuse and exploitation. Former members often struggle with what experts call post-cult syndrome, a complex form of PTSD that includes difficulty making decisions, problems with trust and intimacy, and a persistent sense of confusion about reality. Many require years of therapy to recover from their experiences. The Fellowship of Friends represents a particularly sophisticated form of spiritual abuse, one that preys on people's genuine desire for meaning and transcendence. Burton has created a system that appears to offer spiritual growth while actually stunting it, promising liberation while delivering enslavement. The fact that this organization continues to operate, continues to recruit new victims, and continues to evade meaningful accountability demonstrates just how difficult it can be to stop these predatory groups once they become established. Understanding the fellowship's methods of control and manipulation is crucial not just for those who might encounter this specific group, but for anyone trying to recognize the warning signs of cultic influence. Now let's turn our attention to the most insidious of these three cults, the Remnant Fellowship. What makes this group particularly dangerous is how it weaponized Christianity itself, transforming sacred teachings into tools of psychological manipulation and control. Founded in 1999 by Gwen Shamblin, this organization represents perhaps the most disturbing example of how religious authority can be perverted to serve the darkest impulses of human nature. Gwen Shamblin didn't start as a cult leader. She began as a dietitian in Tennessee, developing what she called the Way Down Workshop, a Christian-based weight loss program that promised spiritual transformation through dietary discipline. Her message was seductive in its simplicity. God wanted people to be thin, and excess weight was a sign of spiritual weakness and disobedience. This twisted theology would become the foundation for something far more sinister. The Way Down Workshop gained massive popularity throughout the 1990s, attracting thousands of followers who were desperate to lose weight and find spiritual meaning. Shamblin's charismatic personality and her ability to quote scripture made her message seem legitimate to many Christians seeking both physical and spiritual transformation. But beneath the surface of dietary advice and biblical quotations, Shamblin was systematically conditioning her followers for total submission. In 1999, Shamblin took the logical next step in her quest for control. She established the Remnant Fellowship Church, claiming that God had called her to create a pure church for the end times. She positioned herself not just as a diet guru, but as a prophet with direct access to divine revelation. The transition from weight loss coach to religious leader wasn't accidental. It was a calculated move to gain even greater authority over her followers' lives. The Remnant Fellowship's theology was a masterclass in manipulation, disguised as biblical truth. Shamblin taught that she was God's chosen vessel for the last days, and that her followers were the elect remnant who would be saved during the coming tribulation. This created an us versus them mentality that isolated members from mainstream Christianity and made questioning Shamblin's authority equivalent to questioning God himself. What made Shamblin's control so effective was how she used legitimate Christian concepts and twisted them into instruments of abuse. She taught that submission to authority was biblical, but in practice this meant absolute obedience to her every command. She preached about dying to self, but used this concept to justify crushing any individual thought or desire that didn't align with her vision. She spoke about God's love, but created an environment where that love was conditional on perfect compliance with her rules. The fellowship's approach to child discipline was particularly horrifying. Shamblin taught that children's wills needed to be completely broken to make them submissive to God's authority. In practice, this meant encouraging parents to use extreme physical punishment, emotional manipulation, and psychological warfare against their own children. The group promoted the use of glue sticks, wooden spoons, and other implements to beat children into submission, claiming this was biblical discipline. Former members describe a systematic campaign of child abuse that was not only tolerated, but actively encouraged by the fellowship's leadership. Children were beaten for minor infractions, forced to sit in uncomfortable positions for hours, and subjected to public humiliation in front of the entire congregation. Parents were taught that any mercy toward their children was actually cruelty, as it prevented the child from learning proper submission to authority. The most tragic example of this abuse came to light in 2003 with the death of 8-year-old Joseph Smith. Joseph's parents, Joseph and Sonia Smith, were devoted members of the Remnant Fellowship who had embraced Shamblin's teachings about child discipline. When Joseph began showing signs of defiance, his parents subjected him to increasingly severe punishment, including beating him with a glue stick and forcing him to stand in stress positions for extended periods. On October 9, 2003, Joseph died from injuries sustained during one of these disciplinary sessions. The autopsy revealed extensive bruising and internal injuries consistent with severe physical abuse. The Smith parents were arrested and eventually convicted of murder, but the remnant fellowship leadership showed no remorse or accountability for their role in promoting the abusive practices that led to Joseph's death. Even more disturbing was the fellowship's response to Joseph's death. Rather than questioning their teachings or showing compassion for the tragedy, Shamblin and her followers doubled down on their beliefs. They claimed that Joseph's death was part of God's plan and that his parents were being persecuted for their faith. This callous response revealed the true nature of the organization, a cult so committed to its twisted ideology that it would sacrifice children to maintain its power structure. The fellowship's control extended far beyond child discipline into every aspect of members' lives. Shamblin claimed divine authority to dictate who could marry whom, what jobs members could take, where they could live, and how they should spend their money. She taught that questioning her guidance was equivalent to questioning God, creating a system where her personal preferences became divine commandments. Financial exploitation was another cornerstone of the fellowship's operation. Members were expected to donate substantial portions of their income to the church, with Shamblin teaching that financial generosity was a sign of spiritual maturity. Those who couldn't afford large donations were made to feel spiritually inferior, while those who gave generously were praised and given positions of authority within the organization. The fellowship also demanded that members relocate to Tennessee to be closer to the church headquarters. This geographical isolation served multiple purposes. It separated members from outside support systems, made it easier to monitor their activities, and created a concentrated community where the group's twisted norms could be maintained without outside interference. Members who moved to Tennessee often found themselves completely dependent on the fellowship for social connections, employment opportunities, and housing. Shamblin's control over marriages and relationships was particularly invasive. She claimed to have prophetic insight into romantic compatibility and would arrange marriages between members based on her supposed divine revelations. She also had the power to end marriages, teaching that divorce was sometimes necessary when one spouse wasn't sufficiently committed to the fellowship's teachings. This created a system where intimate relationships were subject to the whims of a single individual who claimed to speak for God. The psychological manipulation employed by the fellowship was sophisticated and relentless. Members were taught to distrust their own thoughts and feelings, viewing any doubt or questioning as evidence of spiritual weakness or demonic influence. They were encouraged to confess their sins and struggles to leadership, creating a system where personal vulnerabilities could be weaponized against them if they ever considered leaving. The fellowship also used public humiliation as a tool of control. Members who failed to meet the group's standards were subjected to public correction during church services, where they would be forced to confess their failures and submit to Shamblin's authority in front of the entire congregation. This created an atmosphere of fear and surveillance, where members constantly monitored their own behavior and that of others to avoid becoming targets of public shaming. Perhaps most disturbing was how the fellowship perverted the concept of love itself. Shamblin taught that true love meant being willing to cut off relationships with family members who didn't support the fellowship's teachings. Parents were encouraged to disown children who left the group, and spouses were taught to divorce partners who showed insufficient commitment to Shamblin's authority. This weaponization of love created a system where the most fundamental human bonds were subordinated to organizational loyalty. The fellowship's approach to medical care was another area where their control became deadly. Shamblin taught that illness was often a result of sin or lack of faith, discouraging members from seeking medical treatment. She promoted the idea that prayer and proper submission to authority were more effective than medical intervention, leading to situations where members suffered needlessly or died from treatable conditions. Former members described being discouraged from taking medications for mental health conditions, with depression and anxiety being attributed to spiritual problems rather than medical issues. This created a dangerous situation where vulnerable individuals were denied proper treatment and instead subjected to spiritual counseling that often made their conditions worse. The fellowship's end came with characteristic drama and tragedy. On May 29, 2021, Gwen Shamblin died in a plane crash along with her husband, Joe Lara, and 5 other church leaders. The small aircraft crashed into Percy Priest Lake near Nashville, killing all 7 people on board. The irony wasn't lost on many observers. A woman who claimed to have special insight into God's will died in a seemingly random accident that she had no ability to predict or prevent. Shamblin's death created a power vacuum within the fellowship that revealed the fragility of personality-based cults. Her daughter, Elizabeth Shamblin Hannah, attempted to take over leadership, but the organization never recovered its former influence. Many members left the group, finally free from the psychological chains that had bound them to Shamblin's authority. The aftermath of Shamblin's death also brought renewed attention to the fellowship's history of abuse and manipulation. HBO's documentary series, The Way Down, exposed the organization's practices to a wider audience, providing a platform for former members to share their stories and warn others about the dangers of religious extremism. The stories of former fellowship members reveal the devastating long-term effects of cult involvement. Many struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety as they attempt to rebuild their lives outside the organization. Children who grew up in the fellowship often require extensive therapy to overcome the psychological damage inflicted by the group's abusive practices. The fellowship's legacy extends beyond its immediate victims to the broader Christian community. The organization's perversion of biblical teachings has made many people more skeptical of religious authority and more aware of how sacred texts can be manipulated to serve evil purposes. It has also highlighted the need for religious communities to develop better safeguards against authoritarian leadership and abusive practices. The Remnant Fellowship represents a particularly insidious form of cult manipulation because it operated within the framework of mainstream Christianity. Unlike obviously deviant groups, the fellowship used familiar religious language and concepts to mask its abusive practices. This made it harder for members to recognize the danger they were in and more difficult for outside observers to identify the organization as a cult. The fellowship's story also demonstrates how easily religious authority can be perverted to serve personal ambition and psychological pathology. Gwen Shamblin's transformation from diet guru to cult leader shows how individuals with narcissistic tendencies can exploit people's spiritual hunger for their own benefit. Her ability to present herself as God's chosen vessel while simultaneously engaging in manipulation and abuse reveals the dangerous potential of unchecked religious authority. The three cults we've examined, the Fellowship of Friends, the Narconon Program, and the Remnant Fellowship, represent different approaches to the same fundamental goal: the complete control of human beings through psychological manipulation and abuse. Each organization used different methods and appealed to different vulnerabilities, but all shared the common characteristics of authoritarian leadership, financial exploitation, and the systematic destruction of individual autonomy. These groups remind us that cult manipulation is not a relic of the past, but an ongoing threat that continues to evolve and adapt to contemporary society. They show us how seemingly legitimate organizations can hide the darkest forms of human exploitation, and how ordinary people can be drawn into systems that ultimately destroy their lives and the lives of their loved ones. The victims of these cults deserve our compassion and support as they work to rebuild their lives and heal from their experiences. Their courage in speaking out serves as a warning to others and helps us understand the sophisticated methods that predatory groups use to exploit human vulnerability. As we dive deeper into the disturbing truth about modern cults, we encounter organizations that have mastered the art of psychological manipulation on a scale that would make even the most hardened investigators uncomfortable. The Fellowship of Friends, Narconon, and Remnant Fellowship represent something far more sinister than traditional religious movements. They are sophisticated predatory systems designed to exploit the most fundamental human needs for belonging, healing, and spiritual connection. What makes these groups particularly dangerous is their ability to operate in plain sight. Unlike the isolated compound cults of the past, these organizations maintain websites, hold public events, and present themselves as legitimate businesses or spiritual communities. They've learned to weaponize respectability as their primary defense mechanism. The Fellowship of Friends has perfected the art of intellectual seduction. Founded by Robert Burton in 1970, this organization targets educated, affluent individuals who consider themselves too sophisticated to fall for obvious manipulation. Burton's approach is devastatingly effective because it appeals to ego and exclusivity. Members are told they are part of a special group of conscious beings who have evolved beyond ordinary humanity. The financial exploitation within the fellowship is staggering. Members are required to pay monthly fees that often consume 30 to 50% of their income. But this is just the beginning. They're pressured to donate additional funds for special events, property purchases, and Burton's personal expenses. Former members describe selling homes, emptying retirement accounts, and going into debt to meet the organization's financial demands. Burton's control extends far beyond money. He dictates every aspect of members' lives, from their career choices to their relationships. Members must ask permission for major life decisions and are often ordered to relocate to the organization's headquarters in Oregon House, California. This isolation serves multiple purposes. It separates members from outside support systems while creating an environment where Burton's authority becomes absolute. The sexual abuse allegations against Burton are extensive and deeply disturbing. Dozens of former members have come forward with accounts of sexual coercion and assault. Burton specifically targets young male members, using his position of spiritual authority to justify his actions. He tells victims that sexual contact with him is part of their spiritual development, a twisted manipulation that leaves lasting psychological damage. What's particularly chilling about the fellowship is how it uses sophisticated psychological techniques to maintain control. Members are taught to suppress their natural emotional responses and to view any doubts or concerns as signs of spiritual weakness. They're trained to police each other's behavior and to report any signs of disloyalty to leadership. The organization employs what psychologists call thought-stopping techniques. Members are required to engage in constant self-observation and to interrupt any thoughts that might lead to questioning the organization. They're taught a complex system of esoteric concepts that serve to isolate them from mainstream society and create a sense of specialness that becomes addictive. Narconon presents itself as a legitimate drug rehabilitation program, but it's actually a front for Scientology recruitment. This deception is particularly cruel because it targets people at their most vulnerable moment. Families desperate to help addicted loved ones pay tens of thousands of dollars for what they believe is medical treatment, only to discover their family member is being indoctrinated into a cult. The medical dangers of Narconon's program cannot be overstated. The organization rejects proven medical treatments for addiction, instead promoting dangerous detoxification procedures that have resulted in multiple deaths. Patients are subjected to extreme heat in saunas for hours at a time, given massive doses of vitamins that can cause organ damage, and denied proper medical supervision. The psychological manipulation within Narconon is equally dangerous. Patients are isolated from family and friends, told that outside contact will interfere with their recovery. They're subjected to intensive Scientology indoctrination disguised as therapy. By the time they realize what's happening, they're often too psychologically damaged and financially depleted to escape. Former Narconon patients describe being told that their addiction was caused by past life trauma that can only be resolved through expensive Scientology services. They're convinced that leaving the program will result in immediate relapse and death. This creates a psychological trap where victims feel they have no choice but to continue paying for services that are actively harming them. The organization's recruitment tactics are particularly insidious. They target people in crisis, often approaching families in hospital waiting rooms or at addiction support group meetings. They promise quick cures and guaranteed results, preying on desperation and hope. Once someone enters their program, they're subjected to high-pressure sales tactics designed to extract every possible dollar. Remnant Fellowship represents perhaps the most dangerous combination of religious extremism and child abuse. Founded by Gwen Shamblin, this organization used twisted interpretations of Christianity to justify horrific treatment of children. The tragic deaths of Joseph Smith and his sister Chloe in 2021 finally exposed the full extent of the organization's cruelty. Shamblin's teachings promoted what she called biblical discipline, which was actually systematic child abuse. Parents were instructed to use increasingly severe punishments to break their children's will. Children were denied food, locked in closets for hours, and subjected to physical violence that often left permanent injuries. All of this was presented as God's will and necessary for the children's spiritual development. The organization's obsession with weight control extended to children as young as toddlers. When parents were instructed to restrict their children's food intake to dangerous levels, children were weighed regularly and publicly shamed if they gained weight. This created eating disorders and psychological trauma that lasted into adulthood. The financial exploitation within Remnant Fellowship was systematic and comprehensive. Members were required to turn over their entire incomes to the church, living on small allowances determined by leadership. They were forced to sell homes and businesses, with the proceeds going directly to the organization. This financial dependence made escape virtually impossible. Shamblin's death in a plane crash in 2021 provided a glimpse into the organization's true nature. Her obsession with control extended to every aspect of members' lives. She dictated what they could eat, wear, and say. She controlled their marriages, often ordering divorces and remarriages based on her personal whims. She treated children as property to be controlled rather than individuals to be nurtured. The psychological damage inflicted by these organizations extends far beyond their immediate victims. Children raised in these environments suffer developmental trauma that affects their ability to form healthy relationships and make independent decisions. They're taught to suppress their natural instincts and to view questioning authority as sinful. What makes these groups so successful is their ability to identify and exploit specific vulnerabilities. The Fellowship of Friends targets intellectual pride and the desire to be special. Narconon exploits desperation and the stigma surrounding addiction. Remnant Fellowship preys on religious devotion and the desire to be a good parent. These organizations have also mastered the art of legal protection. They use religious freedom laws to shield themselves from scrutiny. They employ teams of lawyers to intimidate critics and suppress negative publicity. They've learned to structure their finances in ways that make it difficult for authorities to trace money or hold leaders accountable. The internet has become both a tool for these groups and a weapon against them. They use social media to recruit new victims and spread their propaganda. But former members have also used online platforms to share their stories and warn others. The challenge is that for every expose published, these groups create dozens of fake positive reviews and testimonials. The human cost of these organizations is immeasurable. Families are destroyed, children are abused, and individuals lose decades of their lives to psychological manipulation. The financial damage often extends to bankruptcy and homelessness. But perhaps most tragically, the spiritual damage leaves victims questioning their ability to trust their own judgment and form healthy relationships. Recovery from cult involvement is a long and difficult process. Victims must rebuild their sense of identity, learn to trust their own thoughts and feelings, and develop the skills necessary for independent living. Many struggle with depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The shame and stigma associated with cult involvement often prevents victims from seeking help. These three organizations represent just a fraction of the modern cult landscape. They demonstrate how sophisticated manipulation techniques can be disguised as legitimate services. They show how predators can exploit the legal system and social institutions to protect themselves while continuing to harm others. Now let's delve deeper into how these cults actually operate and maintain their stranglehold on members. The psychological techniques they employ are far more sophisticated than most people realize, and understanding these methods is crucial to recognizing similar patterns in other organizations that might cross your path. Members aren't just encouraged to view themselves as more evolved than outsiders. They're systematically conditioned to believe that leaving the group would result in spiritual regression spanning multiple lifetimes. Robert Burton masterfully exploits the concept of higher consciousness by creating arbitrary markers of spiritual advancement that only he can validate. Members spend years chasing these imaginary benchmarks, constantly seeking Burton's approval for their supposed spiritual progress. One former member describes the psychological trap perfectly. You become addicted to the feeling of being special, of being chosen for something greater. The outside world starts to feel gray and meaningless by comparison. You're told that your previous life was sleepwalking, and only through the fellowship can you truly awaken. The group's isolation tactics are particularly insidious. Members are gradually encouraged to relocate to the fellowship's compound in Oregon House, California, where they become physically separated from external support networks. Those who can't relocate are pressured to minimize contact with family and friends who aren't members. Critical thinking is systematically dismantled through a practice called non-expression of negative emotions, where any criticism or doubt about the group is labeled as a spiritual failing. Financial control reaches extraordinary levels. Beyond the required donations, members are expected to purchase fellowship-branded products, attend expensive events, and contribute to Burton's lavish lifestyle. The group operates wineries and other businesses using member labor, with profits flowing directly to Burton's personal accounts. Members often exhaust their savings, retirement funds, and even children's college funds to maintain their standing in the group. Perhaps most disturbing are the sexual exploitation patterns. These encounters are presented as spiritual privileges, creating a culture where sexual abuse is reframed as divine blessing. The psychological damage from this manipulation often takes decades to heal. Narconon's deception operates on an entirely different level, exploiting families at their most vulnerable moments. When someone you love is struggling with addiction, you'll consider almost any option that promises hope. Narconon deliberately targets this desperation through sophisticated marketing campaigns that emphasize their natural approach and high success rates that have been repeatedly debunked by independent researchers. The program's medical dangers are systematically hidden from families during enrollment. The sauna detoxification process, which requires participants to spend hours in extreme heat while consuming massive doses of vitamins and minerals, has resulted in documented medical emergencies. Participants have suffered dehydration, heat stroke, vitamin toxicity, and in several cases, death. The indoctrination begins immediately upon arrival. Participants are isolated from outside contact, told their families are suppressive persons who don't understand their recovery journey, and gradually introduced to Scientology concepts disguised as addiction therapy. They're taught that their addiction stems from spiritual trauma that can only be healed through Scientology's methods. Former participants describe a systematic breaking down of their critical thinking abilities. They're subjected to hours of repetitive exercises designed to create a trance-like state of compliance. Any resistance is labeled as evidence of continued addiction, creating a psychological trap where questioning the program becomes proof that you need more of the program. The financial exploitation extends far beyond the initial program fees. Families are pressured to pay for extended treatment periods, additional courses, and handling sessions for family members who express concerns. Many families exhaust their resources trying to save their loved one, only to discover they've been funding a front group for a dangerous cult. The Remnant Fellowship's approach combines religious authority with body dysmorphia in ways that create particularly lasting psychological damage. Gwen Shamblin positioned herself as God's chosen messenger for weight management, creating a theology where thinness equals godliness and obesity represents spiritual failure. This framework allowed her to justify increasingly extreme control over members' most basic human needs. The weigh-ins weren't just about weight loss, they were public rituals of shame and control. Members would be weighed in front of the congregation, with results announced publicly. Those who gained weight faced public correction and increased scrutiny. The psychological impact of having your worth as both a person and a Christian tied to numbers on a scale created eating disorders that persisted long after members left the group. Children in Remnant Fellowship faced particularly severe abuse, justified through twisted interpretations of biblical discipline. Parents were taught that any resistance from children was evidence of demonic influence that required increasingly harsh punishment. The deaths of Joseph Smith and the Ladd children weren't isolated incidents, but predictable outcomes of a system that labeled child abuse as godly parenting. The group's financial control operated through voluntary donations that weren't actually voluntary. Members were expected to give increasingly large portions of their income, with their giving tracked and compared to others. Those who couldn't or wouldn't give sufficiently faced social ostracism and spiritual correction. Many families went into debt trying to maintain their standing in the congregation. What makes these three groups particularly dangerous is their ability to appear legitimate to outside observers. The Fellowship of Friends presents itself as a philosophy school. Narconon markets itself as a medical treatment program. Remnant Fellowship appeared to be a Christian church focused on health and wellness. This veneer of respectability allows them to continue operating despite documented harm to members. The psychological techniques these groups employ, isolation, financial exploitation, sexual abuse, spiritual manipulation, follow predictable patterns that appear across high-control groups worldwide. Understanding these patterns is your best defense against similar organizations that might target you or your loved ones. The most chilling truth about modern cults isn't their secrecy or their violence. It's how they operate in plain sight, wearing the masks of respectability while systematically destroying lives. These aren't isolated compounds in remote deserts. They're sophisticated organizations with websites, tax-exempt status, and members who look just like your neighbors. They've evolved, adapted, and learned to hide their true nature behind legitimate facades. What makes these three organizations particularly insidious is how they exploit our most fundamental human needs: the desire for spiritual growth, the desperate hope for healing, and the comfort of religious community. They've weaponized these universal longings, turning them into tools of control and exploitation. They understand that the most effective predators don't lurk in dark alleys. They smile from behind professional websites and polished brochures. The Fellowship of Friends presents itself as a school for conscious development, attracting intellectuals and spiritual seekers with promises of higher consciousness and esoteric wisdom. Founded by Robert Burton in 1970, this organization has spent decades perfecting the art of spiritual manipulation. Burton claimed to be a conscious being, teaching the fourth way philosophy popularized by George Gurdjieff and Peter Uspensky. But beneath the veneer of spiritual sophistication lay a system designed to serve one man's appetites and delusions. Burton's teachings centered around the concept of creating higher being through conscious work and self-observation. Members were told they were part of an elite group of conscious beings destined to survive an impending apocalypse. This narrative of spiritual superiority became the foundation for increasingly bizarre and controlling behaviors. Burton claimed to receive divine guidance from deceased historical figures he called his angels, including Leonardo da Vinci, Plato, and Jesus Christ. These supposed communications justified his every whim and decision. The organization's recruitment strategy was particularly sophisticated. They targeted educated, successful individuals who were genuinely seeking spiritual development. Art galleries, classical music concerts, and philosophy lectures became hunting grounds for new members. The initial presentations were intellectually stimulating, focusing on legitimate philosophical concepts and artistic appreciation. Only gradually were new members introduced to the more extreme aspects of Burton's teaching. Once inside, members found themselves in an environment of constant evaluation and hierarchy. Burton created a complex system of spiritual levels, with himself at the apex as the only truly conscious being. Members competed for his attention and approval, creating a dynamic of dependency and submission. Those who showed promise were invited to live at the organization's headquarters, a compound called Apollo in Northern California. Life at Apollo was strictly regimented around Burton's needs and desires. Members worked long hours for minimal pay, maintaining the property and Burton's luxurious lifestyle. They were expected to donate significant portions of their income to the organization, with some members giving their entire inheritances or life savings. Financial sacrifice was framed as spiritual work, a way of overcoming attachment to material possessions. The most disturbing aspect of Burton's control was his systematic sexual abuse of male members. Under the guise of spiritual teaching, Burton coerced hundreds of men into sexual relationships. He claimed these encounters were a form of higher being transmission, a way of sharing consciousness. Members who resisted were told they were being controlled by lower centers, their mechanical minds preventing them from receiving higher influences. The organization's response to abuse allegations was swift and sophisticated. They employed lawyers, private investigators, and public relations firms to discredit former members and suppress negative publicity. When lawsuits were filed, they were settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements. The fellowship developed a comprehensive strategy for managing their public image while continuing their abusive practices behind closed doors. Former members describe a systematic process of psychological conditioning that made leaving extremely difficult. They were taught that the outside world was populated by sleeping people, unconscious beings trapped in mechanical existence. The fellowship was presented as the only source of real knowledge and conscious development. Leaving meant abandoning any chance of spiritual evolution and returning to a life of meaningless sleep. The organization's financial structure was designed to create maximum dependency. Members were encouraged to move to areas near fellowship centers where they could only find employment within the organization's network of businesses. They were discouraged from maintaining relationships with family and friends outside the group, gradually isolating themselves from any external support system. Burton's predictions of apocalypse served multiple functions within the organization's control system. They created urgency around spiritual work, justifying extreme sacrifices and devotion. They also provided a convenient excuse when prophecies failed to materialize. Burton would simply announce that the conscious work of fellowship members had delayed the catastrophe, reinforcing their sense of importance and mission. The Fellowship of Friends continues to operate today, though with reduced membership and the influence. Burton, now in his 80s, still claims to receive divine guidance and maintains absolute authority over the organization. The group has adapted to modern technology, using sophisticated websites and social media to present themselves as a legitimate spiritual school. New members are still recruited through art events and philosophy discussions, often unaware of the organization's dark history. What makes the fellowship particularly dangerous is its intellectual sophistication. Unlike stereotypical cults that appeal to obviously vulnerable populations, the fellowship targets educated, successful individuals who believe they're too smart to be manipulated. This creates a form of cognitive dissonance where members rationalize increasingly extreme behaviors because they can't accept that they've been deceived. The second organization on our list operates in a completely different sphere but uses remarkably similar tactics. Narconon presents itself as a drug rehabilitation program, offering hope to families devastated by addiction. What they don't advertise is their connection to the Church of Scientology and their use of dangerous, unproven methods that have resulted in multiple deaths. Founded in 1966 by Scientologist William Benitez while he was imprisoned for armed robbery, Narconon was designed to bring Scientology techniques into the addiction treatment field. The program claims to address the underlying causes of addiction through a combination of detoxification, education, and life skills training. Their marketing materials promise drug-free rehabilitation with success rates as high as 70%. The reality is far more sinister. Narconon centers operate using Scientology methods disguised as secular treatment. The program's core curriculum is based directly on L. Ron Hubbard's writings, though this connection is often concealed from participants and their families. Staff members are typically Scientologists who view their work as both treatment and recruitment for the church. The most dangerous aspect of Narconon treatment is their detoxification program, which they call the New Life Detoxification Program. Participants are required to spend hours each day in saunas at dangerous temperatures, sometimes exceeding 180 degrees Fahrenheit. They're given massive doses of vitamins, particularly niacin, which can cause severe side effects, including liver damage and dangerous drops in blood pressure. This sauna program is based on Hubbard's belief that drug residues remain stored in fatty tissues indefinitely, causing ongoing addiction and mental problems. There is no scientific evidence supporting this theory, and mainstream medical professionals consider the program dangerous. The combination of extreme heat, excessive vitamins, and inadequate medical supervision has resulted in multiple deaths at Narconon facilities. The program's educational component introduces participants to Scientology concepts without identifying them as such. Students learn about Hubbard's theories of the mind, communication, and ethics, all presented as secular addiction treatment. They're taught that their problems stem from misunderstood words and past traumatic experiences that can be resolved through Scientology counseling techniques. Narconon's recruitment strategy exploits families' desperation and ignorance about addiction treatment. They advertise heavily online and through referral networks, presenting themselves as an alternative to traditional medical treatment. Their marketing emphasizes the program's drug-free approach, appealing to families frustrated with conventional treatment methods. The cost of Narconon treatment is substantial, often exceeding $30,000 for a program that can last several months. Families are encouraged to exhaust their resources to pay for treatment, with staff members trained in high-pressure sales techniques. Insurance companies typically refuse to cover Narconon treatment because it's not considered legitimate medical care. Staff training at Narconon centers focuses more on Scientology indoctrination than addiction treatment. Many staff members have no formal training in addiction counseling or medical care. They're taught to view addiction as a spiritual problem that can be resolved through Scientology techniques, ignoring the complex medical and psychological factors involved in substance abuse. The program's approach to medical care is particularly problematic. Participants are discouraged from taking psychiatric medications, even when prescribed for serious mental health conditions. The program promotes Scientology's anti-psychiatry beliefs, teaching that mental illness is a myth created by the psychiatric industry. This has resulted in dangerous situations where participants with serious mental health conditions have been denied appropriate treatment. Narconon's connection to Scientology becomes apparent to participants gradually. Initially, the program appears secular, focusing on basic life skills and communication training. However, as participants progress through the curriculum, they're introduced to increasingly sophisticated Scientology concepts. By the time they realize the connection, many have already invested significant time and money in the program. The organization's response to criticism and regulatory action follows the Scientology playbook of aggressive legal action and harassment of critics. Former participants and their families who speak out often face lawsuits, private investigators, and coordinated harassment campaigns. Regulatory agencies that investigate Narconon facilities encounter similar resistance, with the organization using legal challenges to delay or prevent oversight. Multiple Narconon facilities have been closed by regulatory agencies for safety violations and fraudulent practices. However, the organization continues to operate by opening new facilities under different names or in jurisdictions with less oversight. They've also expanded internationally, targeting countries with less sophisticated regulatory systems. The tragic irony of Narconon is that it preys on people at their most vulnerable moment when they're seeking help for addiction. Instead of providing evidence-based treatment, the program exploits their desperation to recruit them into Scientology while exposing them to dangerous and unproven methods. The families who pay for treatment, believing they're helping their loved ones, are actually funding an organization that puts profits and ideology above patient safety. Our third organization represents perhaps the most perverse form of religious manipulation. The Remnant Fellowship, founded by Gwen Shamblin, combined extreme dietary control with authoritarian Christianity to create a system that justified child abuse and destroyed families in the name of God. Shamblin began her career as a registered dietitian, developing a weight loss program called the Way Down Workshop in the 1980s. The program combined dietary restriction with Christian principles, teaching that overeating was a sin and that true Christians should be thin. This message resonated with many religious people struggling with weight issues, and the Way Down Workshop became extremely popular in Christian communities. However, Shamblin's theology evolved in increasingly extreme directions. She began teaching that most Christians were living in sin, and that only those who followed her specific interpretation of Scripture were truly saved. In 1999, she founded the Remnant Fellowship Church, positioning herself as God's prophet for the end times. The church's name reflected Shamblin's belief that they were the small remnant of true believers prophesied in the Bible. The Remnant Fellowship's approach to weight control went far beyond normal dieting. Members were expected to maintain extremely low body weights, with Shamblin herself serving as the model of spiritual discipline through her emaciated appearance. Food became a moral issue, with overeating considered evidence of spiritual weakness and rebellion against God. But the organization's control extended far beyond diet. Shamblin taught that children were naturally rebellious and required harsh discipline to break their will. Parents were instructed to use physical punishment for even minor infractions, viewing any resistance from children as evidence of sinful nature that needed to be crushed. This philosophy led to systematic child abuse within the organization. The church's teaching on marriage and family relationships was equally extreme. Wives were expected to submit completely to their husbands, while husbands were taught to rule their families with absolute authority. Divorce was forbidden under any circumstances, trapping women in abusive relationships. Children were considered the property of their parents, with no rights or protections from abuse. Shamblin's personal lifestyle contradicted many of her teachings about simplicity and spiritual focus. She lived in a massive mansion, wore expensive clothes and jewelry, and maintained an elaborate lifestyle funded by her followers' donations. Her hair became increasingly elaborate and artificial, creating a bizarre contrast with her teachings about vanity and worldliness. The organization's financial structure was designed to extract maximum resources from members. They were expected to tithe not just 10% of their income, but to give sacrificially beyond their means. Members were encouraged to sell homes, cash in retirement accounts, and take on debt to support the church. This financial dependency made leaving extremely difficult. The Remnant Fellowship's approach to child discipline resulted in multiple deaths. Several children died from abuse that was sanctioned and encouraged by the church's teachings. Parents who killed their children through excessive discipline were supported by the organization, which viewed the deaths as tragic but necessary consequences of proper to child rearing. The organization's response to these deaths was to close ranks and blame outside influences. They portrayed child protective services and law enforcement as persecution of their religious beliefs. Members who questioned the church's teachings about discipline were labeled as rebellious and often expelled from the organization. Shamblin's death in a plane crash in 2021 created a crisis within the organization. She had presented herself as God's chosen prophet, making her sudden death difficult to explain within the church's theological framework. However, the organization has continued under the leadership of her children, maintaining the same extreme teachings and practices. The Remnant Fellowship's targeting of families with weight issues was particularly insidious. They attracted people who were struggling with food and body image, offering them a sense of purpose and community. However, this support came at the cost of complete submission to Shamblin's authority and the adoption of dangerous practices that put children at risk. What unites these three organizations is their sophisticated understanding of human psychology and their willingness to exploit fundamental human needs for their own purposes. They've all developed complex systems for maintaining control over their members while presenting themselves as legitimate organizations to the outside world. The Fellowship of Friends exploits the desire for spiritual growth and intellectual development. Narconon exploits the desperation of addiction and the hope for healing. The Remnant Fellowship exploits religious faith and the desire for moral certainty. All three organizations understand that the most effective manipulation doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like enlightenment, healing, or salvation. These organizations also share sophisticated strategies for managing their public image and responding to criticism. They employ lawyers, public relations firms, and private investigators to suppress negative publicity and intimidate critics. They've learned to present themselves through professional websites, academic language, and association with respected institutions. Perhaps most importantly, all three organizations understand the power of gradual indoctrination. They don't reveal their true nature immediately, instead drawing people in through seemingly legitimate offerings before gradually introducing more extreme elements. By the time members realize what they've gotten involved with, they've already invested significant time, money, and emotional energy in the organization. The tragedy of these modern cults is how they pervert legitimate human needs and aspirations. The desire for spiritual growth, the hope for healing from addiction, and the comfort of religious community are all healthy and natural. These organizations take these positive impulses and weaponize them, creating systems of control and exploitation that can destroy lives and families. Their continued existence and success serve as a reminder that cult behavior isn't limited to obviously extreme groups operating in remote compounds. The most dangerous cults are often those that look most normal, that operate in plain sight, and that attract educated, successful people who believe they're too sophisticated to be manipulated. The sophistication of these organizations also highlights the inadequacy of our current regulatory and legal systems in dealing with religious and therapeutic fraud. They've learned to operate within legal boundaries while engaging in practices that are clearly harmful and exploitative. These three modern cults represent something far more sinister than most people realize. They exist not as relics of a bygone era, but as active, evolving threats that continue to destroy lives in plain sight. The Fellowship of Friends, Narconon, and the Remnant Fellowship have perfected the art of exploitation, wrapping their abusive practices in the language of enlightenment, healing, and salvation. What makes these organizations particularly dangerous is their ability to adapt and survive. When faced with scandals, investigations, or legal challenges, they don't simply disappear. Instead, they rebrand, relocate, or restructure while maintaining their core exploitative practices. The Fellowship of Friends continues to operate from their California compound, still promising spiritual awakening to wealthy seekers while subjecting members to psychological manipulation and financial exploitation. Robert Burton's death in recent years has not ended the organization's control over its members, as the power structure he created remains firmly in place. Narconon facilities continue to open worldwide, capitalizing on the global addiction crisis while delivering dangerous pseudoscientific treatments that have resulted in numerous deaths. Despite repeated investigations and closures, new facilities emerge under different names or in different jurisdictions, always targeting the most vulnerable population, families desperate to save their loved ones from addiction. The connection to Scientology provides these facilities with sophisticated legal protection and public relations machinery that makes them incredibly difficult to shut down permanently. The Remnant Fellowship's influence extends beyond their Tennessee headquarters through their online presence and affiliated churches. Even after Gwen Shamblin Lara's death in a plane crash, the organization's teachings continue to circulate through books, videos, and devoted followers who carry on the dangerous blend of extreme dietary control and authoritarian religious doctrine that has caused so much harm to children and families. These groups succeed because they exploit fundamental human needs that legitimate institutions often fail to address adequately. The desire for spiritual growth, effective addiction treatment, and religious community are not weaknesses to be ashamed of. They are natural human longings that deserve to be met with integrity and compassion. The tragedy is that these cults pervert these noble desires, turning them into weapons of control and exploitation. Recognition is the first line of defense against these organizations. Understanding their recruitment tactics, recognizing the warning signs of high control groups, and knowing how they disguise abuse as enlightenment or treatment can protect both individuals and families from falling victim to their sophisticated manipulation techniques. The patterns are consistent across all three groups: isolation from outside support systems, financial exploitation, surrender of personal autonomy, and punishment for questioning or resistance. The legal and regulatory systems that should protect people from these predatory organizations often prove inadequate. Religious freedom protections, medical treatment exemptions, and the complex jurisdictional issues surrounding international operations create loopholes that skilled cult leaders exploit with devastating effectiveness. This means that individual awareness and community vigilance become even more critical in preventing these groups from claiming new victims. For those who have escaped or are considering leaving these organizations, The path to recovery requires understanding that the trauma experienced was real and serious. The psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, and in many cases physical abuse that occurs within these groups creates lasting damage that requires professional support to address. Former members should not minimize their experiences or attempt to process this trauma alone. The existence of these three cults in contemporary society serves as a stark reminder that the age of dangerous religious movements and pseudoscientific treatments has not ended. In fact, the sophisticated techniques these groups employ, combined with modern communication technology and global reach, may make them more dangerous than their historical predecessors. They represent an ongoing threat that requires constant vigilance from individuals, families, and communities. The Fellowship of Friends, Narconon, and the Remnant Fellowship are not anomalies or isolated cases. They are part of a broader landscape of high-control groups that continue to operate throughout the world, adapting their methods to contemporary circumstances while maintaining their core exploitative practices. Understanding how these specific organizations operate provides insight into the broader phenomenon of modern cult manipulation and the ongoing need for education, awareness, and protection against these sophisticated predators who hide behind facades of respectability while causing immeasurable harm to countless individuals and families.